As if on cue, Trump's attorneys have filed their motion challenging the gag order. We're back with Judge Luttig, Glenn, Lisa, and John. Lisa, tell us what you're learning.
So, Nicole, earlier in the hour, we were talking about some posts that Trump made earlier in the week. There are at least been 4 of them about Judge Merchan's daughter. There was a general consensus in the legal community that the existing gag order did not cover Judge Merchan or his daughter. However, in the wake of those posts, it appears that the district attorney's office had gone to Judge Merchan in a filing that has not yet been made public and asked him, according to this new letter from Todd Blanche, one of the former president's attorneys, to confirm or clarify that the gag order indeed covers Judge Merchan's daughter. In this letter that they just sent and made public, they have said not only does the existing gag order not apply to Judge Merchan's daughter, but any effort to expand it should not happen until after full briefing and would be inappropriate in any event as a prior restraint on former President Trump's free speech rights under the First Amendment. And then, Nicole, most chillingly, they take a swipe at Judge Merchan's daughter, saying that the constitutional problems, and I'm reading from the letter, I apologize, attendant with any additional improper restrictions on protected campaign speech would not only implicate First Amendment rights that belong not only to President Trump, but to the public, but are especially offensive, and this is the quote, where the family member referenced in the pre-motion letter, referring to the letter sent by the DA apparently yesterday, is actively supporting adversarial campaign speech by President Trump's political opponents. In other words, his attacks on her are justified, according to them, because Judge Merchan's daughter is an employee of, if not a leader of, a digital strategy firm that works with Democratic candidates and Democratic affiliated causes. They say that that means that she should be fair game here, Nicole.
John Hallman, I hope every CEO in America is watching, especially the couple of billionaires who just threw in with Donald Trump all their little chips. Because if any of them have kids or grandkids that may someday get a job at a digital data company, that may someday do work for a Democratic mayor, governor, member of Congress, this is what their life will look like.
Oh, and Nicole, I think you're drawing the boundary lines there way too narrow. I think anyone who ends up has a son, daughter, granddaughter, grandson, cousin, nephew, niece, anyone, maybe a friend who's essentially a family member who's working for any firm that Trump perceives as being adversarial to his interests. It doesn't have to be a Democratic firm. It could be a Republican firm full of what he would call rhinos and traitors. It could be any number of different kind of firms. This is not just a war on the Democratic Party, as we know. This is Trump's campaign of retribution in his ever-expanding degree, ambit of attacks encompasses everyone who's not MAGA. Everyone who's not MAGA. And, you know, I had a conversation last fall with Steve Bannon, who basically said, if you won't stand up and say that the 2020 election was stolen, you're not welcome in the MAGA movement. And the MAGA movement is now the Republican Party. So that is not just Democrats. I mean, you're talking about a big sweep. And if you think about those CEOs around the country, Nicole, CEOs who are Republicans in name only, who don't really like Donald Trump very much, but they like Joe Biden less, and they're willing to kind of tolerate Trump for maybe another 4 years. All of a sudden, you're talking about an awful lot of people with an awful lot of children, an awful lot of family members who could be employed by some organization somewhere that Donald Trump doesn't like. I would say the message is pretty clear to them, which is look out.
Judge Luttig, this is all of our own doing, right? Republicans chose Donald Trump again, albeit not as many of them as chose him the last 2 times. And in terms of what the rest of us do, I've now all of the authors of books on tyranny and dictatorships and the slide toward authoritarianism, what they describe is so eerily familiar to every single news cycle. Oh, let's lead with another gag order. Let's lead with another Trump violating a gag order. Let's lead with the fact that no one's going to do anything because it's radioactive to stick him in jail. What would you feed him? I mean, we have the conversation, and it's so similar day after day. How do you break a fever like this?
Nicole, Donald Trump has bludgeoned America into submission to his will over the will of the Constitution and the American people. It's just that plain and that simple. The only way to break that is through the rule of law. the Constitution and the rule of law. Until or unless the courts of the United States apply the Constitution and the rule of law to Donald Trump, then I don't see a way out of the predicament that the country finds itself in today. So the federal courts, they are constitutionally incapable of controlling Donald Trump. Never before in American history have they seen anyone like him, and the Constitution never contemplated a defendant like a former president of the United States in the person of Donald Trump. Until or unless the courts wrap their head around that idea and apply the Constitution and the laws of the United States to the former president, then the only way we get out of this is by a vote of the American people in November.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.